You now, Senator Van Hollen.
Thank you. And thank both of you for your testimony here. And I'm going to start with you, Dr. Polyakova. It's good to see you again. I want to talk about what message we should aim to have come out of the NATO summit with respect to Ukraine, because the messages that the Trump administration has been sending for months, in my view, have undermined our position, our collective US-NATO position in support of Ukraine. We don't have to revisit the spectacle in the Oval Office with President Zelensky and all those other issues. But more recently, we've seen Secretary Rubio acknowledge that Ukraine's need for air defense is significant, but to my knowledge, there's no plan to get Ukraine more air defense. We also saw Secretary Hegseth skip the Ukraine Defense Contact Group meeting in Brussels, the first time a U.S. Secretary of Defense has done so since Russia's full-scale invasion began in 2022. Secretary Hegseth also confirmed that the proposed 2026 budget request includes cuts to funding for weapons purchases to Ukraine. As you mentioned, with respect to the possibility of Ukraine's future, home in NATO, taking that off the table unilaterally is a pretty bad negotiating position. So could you just describe what message you think needs to come out of NATO summit with respect to Ukraine, what kind of united message, and then whether you think what the prospects are for that, given what President Trump's position's been?
Well, we understand that this summit has a much shorter agenda than usual NATO summits, that the communique is also going to be quite short and very simple and straightforward, really focusing on NATO's core capabilities and not talking necessarily so much about our other partners and allies. What I would like to see is, of course, clear messaging from the administration that we will stand with Ukraine against the Russian aggressor. That's what I would like to see. That being said, I think we can probably get to a communique that does mention that Russia's the aggressor, of course, and that Ukraine is the victim and also a partner to the United States. That's what I'm hoping for. Whether it'll be viable, I think, will depend a lot on the conversations between leaders on the ground, as we've seen in the past. I think one very specific thing that I think this NATO summit could achieve, which is not necessarily to NATO but to Ukraine, is to allow the U.S. Sales of U.S. military equipment to Europeans who can then transfer it to Ukraine as they see fit. We have not provided that yet, that third-party transfer, but that's something that I think is very much within reach and something that we can do, and that in itself would send a clear message that even though we may not be debating a new supplemental in this House, though I hope that that may change, that the United States will still allow European allies to buy American and then transfer those capabilities to Ukraine.
I appreciate that. Let me ask both of you now quickly on the subject of coordinating both with our NATO partners, but also more broadly with the EU partners in terms of our approach to China, right? During the first Trump administration, we worked on a bipartisan basis to try to encourage our colleagues to de-risk their economies from China, especially in critical strategic supply chains. There seems to be more confusion this time around in the Trump administration. I would note that on June 10th, our ambassador to NATO, Matthew Whitaker, posted on X, quote, "What happens in the Indo-Pacific matters for transatlantic security. That's why NATO works with partners globally," end quote, something I agree with. But the Deputy Secretary of State, Landau, then posted and then deleted a reply. His tweet, though, was, he obviously didn't get the memo of our deputies committee meeting on this very issue. NATO is still a solution in search of a problem, unquote. What is your view on these sort of different conflicting positions we seem to see within the Trump administration, and how is that hurting our ability to work with our European allies? And finally, when we're putting these large tariffs, across-the-board tariffs on many of our EU partners, and the question is, how can we be asking them to de-risk from China when we and our actions are putting their economies at such risk?
Thank you for your question, Senator. Again, I think the messaging, as you say, has not been clear to European allies on a variety of different issues, including tariffs, including our commitment to Ukraine, including our policy on China. I do think it's early in the administration, and we can allow them a little bit more time to figure out what those positions are. That being said, it is producing a great deal of stress and anxiety among allies to not really have a clear sense of where the administration is going to take its policies. So I would like to see very clear messaging on NATO in particular. I agree with some other members of the administration who said if we didn't have NATO, we'd have to invent it. So NATO does have a very clear purpose, is to defend and deter Russia in Europe, and to allow for lessons to be learned for the Indo-Pacific. NATO's core function is Europe, but there are many lessons that we've been discussing here for the Indo-Pacific environment and to provide some key technologies and capabilities as well. That's what I would like to see come out of the summit, is coherence and a common threat assessment of what NATO is actually doing and why we have it.
If Mr. Rao could be able to.
I would just say, rather than grand pronouncements, what really matters is just the hard work, the daily grind of cleaning Chinese infrastructure out of the critical areas in Europe. I think the Chinese have, or Chinese-controlled companies have stakes in 33 port terminals across Europe. C.K. Hutchinson, thanks in part to President Trump's pressure campaign, is now considering selling 14 of them to a U.S., Swiss, Italian consortium. Chinese are all over the ports of Rotterdam, Antwerp, have a 24.9% stake in the port of Hamburg. All of that just needs to be steadily worked on because it does have carryover effects, for example, military mobility and American troop movements in Europe. I'd also add telecoms to that list. None of the big EU countries are expected to have 5G networks that are entirely free of Chinese products by 2028. We need to try to accelerate those timelines to the extent we can. And that might go below the radar of sort of the grand political declarations at a place like The Hague next week, but I think it's essential for the alliance.
Got it. Thank you. Thank you both.
Thank you, Senator Van Hollen.